This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China has doubled down on its sustained efforts to combat sandstorms and soil erosion in its northern region in the historical mission of the Three-North Shelterbelt Forest Program. During a trip to Inner Mongolia recently, President Xi Jinping said the construction of major ecological projects like the Three-North Shelterbelt Forest Program can only be made possible under the leadership of the CPC. How has China's battle against desertification served the country and its people over the past years? What will be the next stage of China's strategy to strengthen ecological restoration and turn back desert regions? And how to characterize China's ethnic policies from recent remarks made by President Xi? To discuss these questions and more, I'm glad to be joined in the first part by Anna Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, and Charles Tang, chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Anna, I will start with you. This Three-North Shelterbelt program is a bit awkward, if you say it in English. Tell us, what's it about? What's the purpose of it?
Well, it's to cut down the amount of sand. Basically, if you green the desert, it does not kick up dust. But it's part of in 2022, China spent $546 billion on climate change issues, of which desertification is one of them. Compare that to the U.S., which was literally 1/4 of that. China actually led the world. So China's been doing this for quite a long time. The first time when I came to Beijing in 2000, the sandstorms lasted for 3 days. There was yellow dust everywhere. I mean, it was almost impassable. You just did not go outside during those periods. And it lessened due to this desertification. But now you're looking at global warming and the intensity and the number of sandstorms is increasing, not just here in China and around Asia, but in Africa and the Middle East. In fact, the Middle East is even worse now than it's ever been in recorded history. So you're looking at a situation where China is trying to do what it can to battle the ecological damage, but with 8 billion people on Earth, limited resources, climate change, it's going to be tough.
So, how large is the project? We're talking about the Three-North Shelterbelt Forest Program. It's a forest, but 3 of them, I guess, obviously it's consistent efforts that has led to, what we are having now.
Okay, so to give you a kind of a scale, China's forest coverage was about 12% 20, 30 years ago. Today, it's double that. 78 billion trees have been planted in China, roughly doubling what they originally had. So, I mean, the magnitude of what we're talking about is too difficult unless you go to the actual areas. You just, you can see it on a map and you can see it shaded, and it's along the Gobi deserts and other areas where you have arid plains and dust is easily kicked up. But it's really hard to fathom unless you go up there. I have been up there, and it is amazing to see, just miles and kilometers and kilometers. You can just go endlessly, and you could see the efforts that were being made.
It's massive ecological projects. Charles, you are a frequent visitor of China, and the past, how China, looked like, and now, how it is today. So tell us, how much progress do you see in terms of, environmental protection, in terms of ecological progress here?
I think that we are very lucky to have several world leaders who are very ecological conscious to save our planet. And of course, Chairman Xi Jinping, when the United States left the Paris Accord, the world looked towards Chairman Xi Jinping as the standard bearer for ecological preservation. And of course, China's fight against desertification is a gigantic project. We have like President Lula in Brazil, who is struggling to save the Amazon forest after the devastation of the last government. And we have other world leaders, such as King Charles, who is very ecological conscious. So I think that China is very lucky to have Chairman Xi Jinping fighting so hard to preserve the ecological system and recover the desertification that is progressing and expanding all over the world.
Yeah, of course, anyone who are familiar with the Chinese, let's say, the spending, the projects, and also the program, the planning by the Chinese government in terms of protecting the environment, the soil. Of course, we have a term in Chinese, we call it ecological civilization, Charles. So I guess that's what you refer to. I mean, how much attention the Chinese government is paying to this sector.
Well, I think that this is the fight against desertification is one of the major projects for the ecological preservation in China, and I think that a tremendous amount of resources, like was mentioned, millions and millions of trees have been planted to fight the desertification of of China.
Yeah, and there's of course this year it's a bit different. The spring we all are in Beijing. Basically throughout this springtime, we have encountered a couple of times of sandstorms, and then people question. They are casting doubts about these projects, like the Three-North. They say, "Oh, we have these projects. Are they working or not?"
Well, they are working, because without those projects, you would really have a problem. I mean, I can't stress to you enough, if people can remember back especially before 2008, the amount of sandstorms and how terrible they were. I mean, for 3 days, literally, you couldn't see, beyond your hand. It was really, really something. So this idea that it hasn't improved, it has. But this is one of the issues with being middle class, having a large middle class, is they are expecting everything to be perfect, and when it isn't, they tend to say, "Oh my goodness, somebody should do something."
Not perfect, should be perfect.
Yeah, it should be perfect. What is the government doing? Why is it perfect?
If it's not, is something wrong?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and this is common to many areas, but
Yeah.
I mean, China has an active program. I mean, one of the things that I admire about China is that when they see a problem, they study it and they try to solve it. Whereas in the US, other places, many democracies, it's very difficult, because one government comes in and they say there's a problem, but they can't carry through because the next government says, no, it's not a problem.
Priorities could be different
Yes.
for different governments over there. Well, let's have a short break. We'll be back right after this. Now we shift to China's business ties with the West, as the visit to China by leaders of US and European companies have been intensifying in recent weeks. There have been more meetings between top Chinese officials and business leaders despite increasing pressure the White House has been imposing on China. How do overseas business leaders feel about the opportunities in China at this time of great uncertainty? What messages do they bring with them? To take a closer look at commercial ties between China and the West in general at the time of de-risking, in this part we'll also be joined by Wang Dan, Chief Economist at Hang Seng Bank, Professor Ian Beck from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Klaus Zenko, Vice President of European Chamber and Chair of South China Chapter. Welcome to the show. Well, Wang Dan, I will start with you. So we do see a frequent visit, including Elon Musk, and leaders of multinational companies from European countries, from the other US, obviously. They have been here. For example, Elon Musk met leaders of several ministers of the Chinese side, and including Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang. I wonder, what's your take of this flurry of visits by leaders, CEOs of multinationals here in China?
Well, we know that the biggest event happening in China this year is the change of leadership. it's more critical than ever for foreign businesses and especially multinationals to understand the policy trends, new intentions of Chinese government. And nothing can replace a face-to-face visit. Although those CEOs, of course, they can read reports and hear other people's analysis. But once you're really underground to meet the Chinese officials, a lot of things they might have demonized about China would turn out to be false. And many of them have realized that China's strength as the biggest consumer market or the center of the manufacturing for the world hasn't really changed. So there are opportunities. Of course, there are risks, but there is more realization that it is hard to replace China with another country or even with a combination of other countries.
So Yuan, do you think they are probably also have something to do with the pandemic? For 3 years, in China we had this rather strict quarantine, and traveling was very difficult. And now when China is fully opening, of course, business people want to take a look at the second or the most largest market in the world.
Without doubt, there are, I think, three things going on in addition to what Wang Dong has already explained, which is, yes, the opening up again after the pretty severe restrictions China imposed, making it quite difficult to do business, particularly from outside. Second, shall we say, a slight easing of the geopolitical tensions. They haven't gone away, but they're easing. And this famous word decoupling, I think, is something which is maybe going to fade into the background compared with what it was before. And the third is very clearly that nobody can ignore China either as a market or perhaps more significantly for many of these CEOs who've been coming like Elon Musk, the fact that it's a significant supplier of components of their products. The same with Apple, with Tim Cook. The same sometimes with the CEOs of the banks like Citibank or Jamie Dimon when he's been coming from Morgan's. They're looking at business opportunities, the fact that they're already invested, they want to continue to invest. All of this comes together to make it time to overcome the obstacles that have been there over recent years.
Mr. Zanko, we know the background is the tension and there is uncertainty. Though decoupling now has been changed into de-risking, but people still are not sure what kind of relationship there will be. What are the outcomes? How much do we know about their visits, and what's the message here?
Yes, thank you very much for having me here this evening. And I'm with the European Chamber, as you mentioned, and we have 1,800 members nationwide. And the Chamber is in China since 23 years. So the last 3 years was really, let's say, stamped by the pandemic, and in-person visit meetings was not possible. So the human factor was actually missing, and the ideas and opinions drifting apart. So that's why now the leaders of the governments of EU and entrepreneurs are visiting China to see what is the situation, and also to see the new leadership, meet the new leadership with the new policies. In general, it's a good start that they come and do the bilateral talks. The first step is done. So the businesses, the entrepreneurs, they see this as a sign that the China market is important. And of course, we know the China market is the largest, almost we can say, and there's a lot of opportunities. And multinational companies, they are here. They will not, let's say, stop to invest in China, because in China, for China, the market is too huge to leave it aside.
Mr. Zanko, you talked about the China market, probably made in China and for China. So we are seeing, of course, last month, for example, Tesla announced a second factory in Shanghai, basically dedicated to the production of large-scale batteries. Volkswagen also unveiled plans to pour another $1 billion into a new development center for EV, electric cars. So JP Morgan, we see they have doubled, at least, if I'm not sure, if I'm not wrong, about the employees here in China. So I would say China remains an attractive investment spot for a lot of multinational companies despite the tensions?
I think the multinational companies' investments, they are here for Chinese markets, and they look into the business. And at the same time, the China government is promoting the consumption, and the e-vehicle strategy is also there that in a few years there will only be electric vehicles or new energy vehicles available. So that sector is surely the right time now to invest. Another interesting industry and sector is the chemical industry. That is a huge demand here in China itself to produce the raw material, and the big multinational companies from Europe and US, they surely know why they are here in China. Healthcare is also very important and a strong demand on the market. So opportunities are here, challenges are also still here, but I think the opportunities are greater than for the future than to overcome the challenges.
Well, Charles, I think CEO Jensen Huang of NVIDIA said recently in an interview, he said like if we are deprived of the Chinese market, we don't have a contingency for that. Basically, there's no other China. There's only one China market. You're from Brazil and you are familiar with the China market. I wonder, how does Brazil or business people in Brazil see the China market amid the, let's say, rising tensions or the uncertainty between China and the US basically here?
As you know, Brazil is the largest trading partner of Brazil. Brazil has had tremendous amount of surplus in its trade with China. And from the visit of President Lula, the recent visit of President Lula to China, you can see that Brazil is paying total attention to its economic relations with China. And if you compare the visit of President Lula to China and the visit of President Lula to the United States, you can see that Brazil is paying a lot of attention to its largest trading partner, which is China. And China is so important for Brazil, especially now after 4 years of a government that, let's say, was not so appreciative of the Chinese relationship. I believe that China will help Brazil to build its infrastructure, like China did for Africa. And because of the infrastructure that China built in Africa, the fastest growing countries in Africa have been countries that China invested massively into building their infrastructure. And Brazil also needs these investments in infrastructure.
Well, Wang Dan, here, of course, you see the struggling by the multinational companies, or some of them, in their pursuit of the China market. At the same time, they have a home market, they have their own government to think of. But still, like what has been said by Elon Musk, that he's against decoupling with China. He said the interests of the U.S. and China are like intertwined like conjoined twins. Basically very difficult to separate. Otherwise, both sides will suffer. Are we seeing a clear strategy of those multinational companies in managing their future operation in China, with the, of course, the background of this not that comfortable background, let's say?
Well, the reality is every multinational is rethinking about their China strategy. And when it comes to relocation of some of their production lines away from China, almost every manufacturing company that I talk to is doing this. And it's not just the foreign companies. Some of the domestic companies are also following this trend. And for some of those companies, in China for China is certainly important. But what's more important is the calculation of political risks in the future, because no company now has the illusion about the prospect of China-US relations anymore. People know that the road ahead is bumpy, there might be accidents, and things can go wrong. So in this big background, then many of them have to consider whether they want to build say, a spin-off of the China subsidiary, or if they want to change the ownership structure, or if they want to relocate more to other Asian countries around China. But one way or another, every company understands that as a market, China has opportunities that no other emerging markets can replace. So they would want to invest China long term. And now is a very volatile period, and everyone is very cautious about the cost associated with geopolitics.
Ian, earlier you mentioned about slight easing of the tension, basically from previous talk of decoupling to the recent at the G7 summit. The agreement is is de-risking efforts from the China market. Are we clear, like what kind of de-risking strategy, like European or Brussels or Washington, they are to have? Are they identical?
Not quite. I think there is a difference between what Europe wants, particularly exemplified by Emmanuel Macron's visit to China, where he wants to try to be friendly but reasonably firm, and the somewhat more hostile approach you tend to see in Washington. But even Washington, I think, is easing on this. They see China as a potential partner in dealing with the Ukraine war. They want to recognize the role of China in the global economy. There's a saying sometimes associated with banks, important banks, that they're too big to fail. And I would add a parallel one for China. It's too big to ignore. You can't leave China out of a global strategy for any company or for any jurisdiction in other parts of the world, even though at times you may want to some extent, diminish the risk of dealing exclusively with China for some vital products. So there's that tension that all countries are trying to navigate and all companies are trying to navigate. They don't want to offend Washington, but they also want to take advantage of the Chinese market and supply capabilities.
Okay, Mr. Zenko, so they don't want to offend Washington, but at the same time, the China market is important. So it's kind of a dilemma here. Do you think I don't know, like maybe their voices can be heard back in their own capitals, or is there any impact of their voices in terms of the growing plan of their company? So in terms of growth, the risk is actually from Washington, not from China.
I mean, the risk is always there, so you have to do your risk analysis properly. Then I think you can overcome those issues. Most of our members in the European Chamber, they would like to stay away from the geopolitical issues and do business-to-business talks. So they are quite, let's say, convinced that they can manage the risks. So, of course, once you know your risk, you know how to act, and that is the way to do. And for example, we are the European Chamber here. We are in China. When von der Leyen came from the EU Commission, so she also met with our president, the EU Chamber president, to get the briefing first, because we are here in China. We know the climate. The climate in Europe is perceived in a different way about China, so we can communicate and be the bridge between China and Europe.
Mm-hmm. Charles, I wonder, how do you see the Chinese handling, let's say, either decoupling or de-risking from Washington, and also at the same time, when the Chinese ministers, when they met Elon Musk, I think the message is very clear from the Chinese side, that is, they are open to business and they welcome investment from overseas, from around the world. So is that the right way or effective way to deal with this de-risking efforts here, the threat?
Well, I think it's very sad that there are pressures for decoupling. For two great countries with two great people, like the US and China, instead of working together to improve the world, we are basically facing tensions between the two great powers. And that, of course, affects the whole world. And although the business, like was said, businesses want to do business, and money really should not have politics or nationalities. But however, of course, most companies do not want to offend Washington, but they do want to make money with China. So I think that, can you imagine if the U.S. and the China join forces, what contributions, great contributions, they can make for the world. But however, like was mentioned, the road ahead is bumpy. And of course, it affects the whole world, including Brazil, although Brazil has very good commercial relations and economic relations with China.
Wang Dan, of course, a lot is also at stake with the performance of the Chinese economy. The latest figures we have is for the trade, for example, the first 5 months, it's actually increased for 4.7%, and exports basically down 0.8%, but imports up 2.3%. I wonder, what do you make of that?
Well, we can see this general trend that export is declining faster than import. And it's not something that China can control, because the declining demand from the US and Europe has been such a large influence for the Asian economies. It's not just for China, but also Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and all the other producers. So for China, the economy this year is very difficult. Although I believe there's no problem that China can reach its 5% GDP target, but for domestic demand and overseas demand, there are a lot to be done to really restore people and investors' confidence, and it's no easy job.
So I think the World Bank has recently just updated their forecast, raising the Chinese economic growth to 5.6% from previous 4.1. So still quite optimistic about the overall economic growth here in China.
Oh, absolutely. People still can see the potential, and a lot of people are expecting bigger policy response from either the central bank or the state council. So far, the priority is still to de-risk in the housing market and the local government debt. And once the situation is more clear, I believe in the second half of the year, we'll see more policy stimulus in terms of consumption and investment.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.